Welcome to the Commercial Edge podcast with me, Chris Webber. Come and enjoy a virtual coffee while I share my experience and ideas that could help you overcome difficult people at work. I share my thinking and insights so that you can find new ways to overcome challenges and gain a commercial edge and unleash the power of people. Welcome to this episode of the Commercial Edge podcast. Today we're going to be talking about people who hate getting feedback. I think we all know the type of person we're talking about, that you try to give them feedback, they don't seem to listen to anything that you say, or they seem to listen to whatever you say and nothing happens. Either way, feels like you've been wasting your time. I want to talk about a few examples of what happens and how it happens. I want to talk about why it matters. We're going to discuss why it drives us crazy, because I do think this is the kind of stuff that can drive certain personalities crazy. So we're going to explore a little bit about personality and why it drives us nuts. What are these people afraid of? I want to talk about a bit about that as well. What are they afraid of when it comes to getting feedback and taking on board feedback? I'm going to share some insight around Thomas Kilmann that might help you to understand some of this. And I'm going to talk about some strategies from success, actions that you can take that will help you overcome this particular problem, this particular issue. So there are lots of examples of this, but I think there's a good one to kind of illustrate what happens and why it happens. I want you to imagine that you're sitting on a bus. Bus is full of people, and then you overhear somebody talking or thinking about where they're supposed to be going, and it becomes obvious that they're on the wrong bus. They're going in a different direction than they should be. What do? Do you go over to them and tell them that you've overheard what they've been saying and that they're wrong and they need to get off the bus and go somewhere else? Or do you do nothing? It's a dilemma. And I know people who are stuck in this dilemma and who'll do nothing because they feel that it's rude to be overhearing other people's conversations. Now, usually there's somebody on the bus who will say, yes, I'll go and talk to them and I'll explain to them that they're on the wrong bus. And they'll be nice about it, and this person will be very grateful. There's a story of a traveller in India who got on the wrong bus, who asked people whether this bus goes to a certain city, and the people on the bus just nodded. And it turns out that he was on the wrong bus, and he only found out 3 or 4 hours later after he'd gone to a completely different city. And part of the reason was that these people felt it would be humiliating for him to tell him that he's on the wrong bus. And surely it would have been better to tell him the truth. But in that culture, in that society, protecting his honour, protecting his status was really important. And they didn't want to embarrass the poor guy. Now, if you think about that, that's something that happens, that we have these cultural challenges with people, but also people within our own circle who understand disagreements differently to us. And therefore, when we get feedback, it affects how they respond to that feedback. A wonderful example of why this matters is that it gives you a commercial edge. And that's what this podcast is all about, is getting a commercial edge. A number of years ago, I read Phil Knight's book, Shoe Dog. He is the founder of Nike. It's an incredibly well-read book. Lots of people I know have read it, and I see it around on trains and buses. And the couple of things that stood out to me in that story, one of them was that he was trying to make running popular at a time when running wasn't popular. You didn't see mass entrance into marathons. You didn't see people running the streets. It was very much an expert's sport, people running around tracks. And he used the technology and he used endorsement to try and encourage people to take up running, to get more involved in running. But the second thing that he did was he started to do business in Japan. He got manufacturing contracts with people in Japan using their technology, their expertise to help manufacture, design, and build the running shoes for him. Now, that was a really difficult thing for him to do. First of all, there was the language and the cultural barriers between Japan and the US, which are quite significant. There were also historical issues after the Second World War that were still barriers between those countries doing a lot of business. And so he went out on a limb. And the story in the book tells a whole range of examples of challenges he had, difficulties, problems with dealing with his manufacturing partners over in Japan. And the whole essence of how he overcame these was the foundation of building the brand, building Nike as it is today. But being able to take that on, being able to go for it, is one of the key elements that helped him get a commercial edge. Because he was prepared to embrace those different cultures and find a way through, find a way of overcoming those problems, that is why he was able to be so successful. So if you are able to navigate difficult people, i.e., people who don't communicate the way you do, don't communicate the challenges that the way that you accept challenges, won't accept feedback like you accept it, don't give feedback like you accept it, there is a commercial opportunity. Because it's when you get outside of your usual sphere of influence that you find new customers, new opportunities. And today, we are working in an ever more interconnected society. You can stay at home wherever you are, and you can work with cultures all around the world without leaving home. It means you don't need to embrace their way of living in order to do business. But that also makes it a bit harder to understand differences. So, with some reflection, with some thinking, you can find ways to do business, to find solutions to this. So, this podcast episode is about feedback and people who reject feedback or ignore feedback and how you can do better with them. Sometimes that's a cultural challenge, sometimes it's in your own culture, and it's just people who think differently to us. So let's think about, why does this drive us crazy? I'm from a small town called St Helens in the northwest of England, between Liverpool and Manchester. I lived there for the majority of the early part of my life. First 20 years, I hardly ever left there. And what I've learned since I left is that St Helens is a very direct culture. People there are very comfortable giving people direct feedback. I was a salesman, and I remember going to head office, being invited down to a leadership team meeting, a cross-functional leadership team meeting that I was there to present some ideas, but then I joined the rest of the meeting and I got involved in the conversation. And I asked some very direct questions to people as to why we were doing certain things, why we weren't doing other things, and how we could perhaps improve. And afterwards, I was taken aside and told that I need to find a new way to communicate. I was way too direct, way too confrontational in the way that I delivered that. To me, it was completely natural. I had no understanding that people thought, felt, and acted in a different way. And I think, to me, that was like a life-changing moment of, wow, we're all British. Everyone in that meeting was from the United Kingdom. And yet people were telling me, you can't communicate that way. What is normal for us may not be normal for other people. Just think about that. That if you are comfortable giving feedback, if you're comfortable receiving feedback, that does not mean that other people are comfortable in the same way. And because of that, you have a problem. Because You raise an issue with somebody, bit of feedback on project they're working on, bit of feedback between a customer and a supplier, bit of feedback from a manager and a colleague, and suddenly you've got a real confrontation, a problem. That sometimes escalates into an argument, and I'll deal with that in a different episode. But sometimes it ends with nothing, and the other person just walks away, maybe nods their head, and you think, that's landed. They've got the message. Maybe they haven't. Maybe they completely disagree with you, and they just don't accept feedback the way you might accept feedback. Challenge is, how can you change your style? It's like learning to write with a different hand. I am so comfortable giving direct commentary, direct feedback, that when I need to do it differently, when I need to be much more obtuse about the feedback I give, it's almost impossible. And it's so frustrating. I find myself thinking, why can't someone just tell the truth? Why can't they just be open? Why can't they just do it? We can't. We've got to find a way to communicate the way they need to be communicated with. Otherwise, any feedback is a waste of time. But it's understandable that it will drive us completely crazy that someone just doesn't get it, just doesn't listen to the things that we've got to tell them. So let's explore what they're afraid of. Why are they like this? Well, I'll pose you a question. Imagine and think about what you want other people to say about you at work. What do you want your manager to say about you? What do you want your colleagues to say about you? What do you want your customers to say about you, about how you do business, about who you are? Most people will say things like, I want people to see me as smart. I want people to see me as successful. I want people to see me as a leader. I want people to see me as knowledgeable. These are brilliant things, highly aspirational things, things that you can take real pride in and build up over time. They don't just appear in a moment. Being seen as smart takes time. Being seen as a leader takes time. You have put effort and focus into creating these things. So now I'll ask you, how might you feel if some people said the opposite to those things? Angry? Frustrated? Disappointed? Humiliated? How would you feel if they did that in front of peers, in front of colleagues, in front of your manager? I remember giving someone feedback during a training course, and I hadn't realised their manager was in the room. And afterwards, they came over to me and they were a bit confrontational to me that I'd given them this direct feedback in front of their manager. And I said, hey, it's my job to give you feedback. That's the opportunity for learning. But they felt really quite frustrated and angry that I had, in their mind, brought them down in front of their boss. People get quite defensive over it because for them, these things are very important, and being respected and being important matter. Now, they are sensitive to the fact that feedback is a challenge to them. If you're giving them feedback on a piece of work that they've done, it might not make them look not smart. It might be questioning their success. It might be showing that they're not doing a great job as a leader. It might indicate that they're not as knowledgeable as they claim to be. You are challenging something quite personal to them, quite important to them. And therefore, they're going to reject that feedback. They're just going to object to it because to accept it to them could be very difficult emotionally, a very difficult emotional place to be. So they're going to reject that feedback. So what we've got to really think about is, how do we communicate that? Because thinking about how you communicate it can soften the impact on them emotionally. We're not trying to damage someone's status and ego. We're not trying to tear people apart. What we're trying to do is actually improve them. Your feedback mostly comes with positive intent, trying to improve. But the way it's delivered can make them feel really small, make them feel questioned, challenged, and uncomfortable. Especially if they have a personality type or a culture type which is objections to or avoiding confrontation. A couple of guys back in the 1970s called Thomas and Kilman started to explore how we respond to conflict. Did a lot of research with many people, and still ongoing actually, and you can go online to their website and you can complete this questionnaire, and it will give you a report which tells you all about how you respond in conflict. You can also do a team report, and they have various different facilities available to do team working and team building to help you understand the makeup of your team. Really interesting element to do, aspect to do, if you're working with your team and you want to understand people a little bit more. And what they characterized were 5 different conflict styles. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them today. You can go online and have a look at their stuff if you're interested. But one of these conflict styles is to avoid conflict. This is a personality who hates confrontation, hates conflict. And their reaction to conflict and to tension is to avoid it, to leave, to walk away, to delay a discussion, find anything to avoid an actual confrontation, because for them it makes it feel very uncomfortable and they don't want to do it. It doesn't matter how much you push, they want to escape you from this. Now, there's a natural instinct to that. We all have this essence of self-preservation, especially if you're up against someone who appears to have more strength or more power than you have. So therefore, you could be dealing with someone whose preference, and we all have a preference, is an avoiding situation. Now, if your personal preference is a challenging one, where you're very comfortable with confrontation, very comfortable debating and discussing because of your culture or because of who you are going to scare this person. They're going to be terrified of what you talk about and how you do this. So they will maybe even avoid conversations with you because they just find you quite terrifying personality. Being aware that someone avoids conflict is very important. Now, there are certain cultures for whom this is very natural, that they don't want confrontation. Their natural style for disagreement is indirect, and therefore using strategies that I'm going to talk about becomes really paramount. Trying to engage someone in a direct debate and a discussion is not going to work. I remember being in sales and dealing with quite a lot of customers from South Asia. And South Asian culture can be an example of this, where they don't like direct conflict, they don't like direct disagreement. And therefore, when I was trying to question them on products they were using, they didn't want to disagree with me. When I questioned them on, will you use my products, they just agreed with me because, well, that's easier. But it was really hard to get actual commitment, even though they'd said it, because they just avoided conflict. So learning the culture of people you're doing business with and engaging with is very, very important. And therefore, there are various different strategies that you need to consider on how you can be successful. And the most important thing is to accept you might have to change your style. If you are someone who likes to give direct feedback, who likes to be clear and concise on ways that people can improve or changes that they need to make. If you come up against someone who feels threatened by this criticism as they see it, and or is a person who avoids conflict, your style will not work. Think again. Do something different. Except you're going to have to learn to write with your left hand or your right hand, depending which hand you normally write with. And all that means is that you can do it, but it takes some practice. You might feel frustrated. Certainly I do. The biggest thing for me is I just want to say the truth as I say it. I just want them to hear, let's just cut through all the noise. Let's just say what we've got to say. But it isn't going to work. It's not going to help me. In fact, it will alienate me from them because their structure, their ways of thinking will mean, let's not engage with him. He's terrifying. He's too aggressive. And that can be something I've been accused of in the past, is being too aggressive. And it comes from this natural inclination to be a bit more direct than perhaps some people are comfortable with. So I don't want people to disengage with me. My challenge as a coach, as a manager, as a leader, and dealing with people who are managing difficult customers is to be empathetic and supportive, gentle, kind where necessary. So it means I need to embrace this idea of being vague and obtuse, not saying what I really mean, leaving it out there, letting reflection drive the thinking, have a really assertive approach, trying to encourage people to think about their own actions and their own behaviors rather than me pointing it out directly to them. Because it's only when they start to do the self-reflection that they will encourage change. And this takes time. It requires some patience. It's not that I tell them the answer and they switch to do it. It means I ask some questions, I give them some space to think, to reflect, and maybe to consider other options and alternatives. I also need to create a safe space where they feel able to have that reflection, either with me or on their own. So, what are the key actions that you can take away to help you deal with people who reject feedback? Well, the first one is to ask a series of questions. Try and get them to think rather than to challenge them directly. Questions fall into two categories as I see it. There are very aggressive questions. Why did you do that? That is a very aggressive question. Why? Spits into the heart of beliefs and attitudes and emotions. Very potent question. In this case, way too much. You have to be more gentle in your questioning, considering things like, what were the options that were available to you while you were making this decision? How did you come to this conclusion? Just reflecting in the moment and using a series of questions to gently probe. And what you're trying to surface is that their conclusion might not be the right one, that there are other people who might see things differently. Even asking the question, do you think other people might see things in a different way? What might drive them to draw different conclusions to you? Those are questions that, whilst you want to tell them the truth and be cut to the chase, they can use for self-discovery. Think about telling stories. I'm sure you've heard of the hare and the tortoise story, or the lion and the mouse. The hare and the tortoise is the classic tale of how a hare raced a tortoise and the hare became arrogant and overconfident, self-assured, and kept stopping to sleep and to rest and was cocky. Whereas the tortoise just every day committed, plodded along, slow and steady. And eventually it was the tortoise that won the race. The message is be consistent. Each day, show up, do what's necessary, work hard. Often that's better than trying to be flashy and arrogant. That story was written in 600 BC. Aesop's Fables. Aesop wrote a whole range of stories that contain lessons on how we should live. Similar to this, another example is The Lion and the Mouse, where a lion laughs at a mouse, but when the lion is caught by a hunter's net, it is the mouse who's able to free him, showing that an act of kindness goes a long way, regardless of how small that act of kindness seems to be. These are lessons that don't directly criticize people. They don't say, oh, you're unkind, or don't say you are arrogant, but they give examples that people can relate to and easily connect that, well, that's not the way to behave. This is a much better way to behave. Those stories are really powerful, and also they resonate. Those are 2,500 years old, and we still tell them. How can you remember a piece of feedback from someone? A story, some illustration, that is a much more memorable way to communicate. It takes a lot of effort. They're indirect, but the lessons are clear. And throughout the ages, people have used these illustrative stories as a way of landing points. So think about how you could use those. It takes a bit of effort, but honestly, it's well worth it. The final couple of points are really just the way you structure the conversation. Listen attentively. If you're going to ask questions that try and encourage conversation, encourage self-reflection, you're going to need to pay close attention to what they're saying. Make them feel fully engaged, fully respected, and really important that you are paying full attention to them. Make them feel special, like this is real time. And take the conversation away from a group so that they can feel safe. Make it protective and protect their ego. If their fear is being made to look foolish in front of colleagues, in front of their boss, in front of their peers, in front of their customers, then having a conversation away from this group is a much safer space for them, especially if you're prepared to respect their style and their ways to communicate. There are always ways to overcome these difficulties. There are so many spaces where we have friction in style of communication, in ways of thinking, and I really want to encourage you not to just get frustrated by people who don't do it your way, but to see that as an opportunity to unlock additional value. If you've got some questions or some examples of problems that you're having, I'd love for you to share those in the show comments or send me a message, because those are the things that I'd love to start to address in future episodes. Thank you very much for listening. Talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to the Commercial Edge podcast. I'll be back soon with another episode. Join me then when we delve into more difficult conversations. See you next time.